If you won the equivalent of $30,953,462.42 and then decided to blow it all by trying to take down the very same people who gave it to you, what would you do? Another year, another lump sum of losers fighting it out for financial freedom. Only this time there's a twist. One of the contestants is not like the others. He's actually done this before and won. So that probably means he's got some valuable insight that'll help him breeze past the competition, right? Guess we'll find out. I'm going to break down the mistakes made, what you should do, and how to beat the death games in Squid Game Season 2. Gi-hun has a new lease on life. All his debts are paid off, he's got more money than he'll ever need. And in just a few short steps, he'll be able to leave his troubled past behind and reinvent himself somewhere new. It's just too bad he's not actually gonna go through with it. You see, our guy only came upon his fortune after prevailing in a battle royale of childish death games orchestrated by a shadowy cabal of masked lunatics. And because the man's got a moral compass roughly 2 times bigger than his brain, he's decided to all away in a bid to avenge the fallen players and shut these games down once and for all. Of course, if you're like me, you're probably wondering how in the hell he could possibly intend to do that. After all, he doesn't even know where the whole thing took place, much less who put it on, and even if he did, let's stop and think about the logistics real quick. Okay, you already know that they have a small army of pink dudes equipped with automatic weapons and God knows what else. They clearly have the financial means to do pretty much anything that they want, as both the games, recruiting methods, and facilities seemingly spared no expense in their design. And on top of all that, they would almost certainly have to have deep ties within the government and law enforcement to keep nosy bureaucrats from asking too many questions. Remember, there were 456 players in the last game, and just about all of them wound up dead. Do you honestly think that that's gonna go unnoticed? According to the Korean Herald, more than 70,000 adults are reported missing in Korea each year, making the daily average roughly 200. This would be more than twice that. Plus, if it's anything like the United States, the overwhelming majority of missing persons cases are resolved in less than a few days, whereas in this case, none of these people would ever be seen again. So sure, maybe if it were simply a one and done, it could potentially fly under the radar, but we already know that that's not the case, as Gi-hun only decided to throw his life away after seeing one of the recruiters out slapping up randos on the subway. Nerds, do you ever wonder if we're alone in this universe? Well, the correct answer is not yet. But thanks to today's sponsor, we're getting a little bit closer every single day. I'm talking about Warhammer 40k, Tacticus. Tacticus is a turn-based tactical strategy game set in the far-flung 41st millennium. In this dark and dystopian future, mankind knows only eternal war. Because, let's be honest, a game about peace would be boring and stupid. And believe me, you won't find none of that lovey-dovey nonsense here. Instead, Tacticus puts you in control of the universe's most powerful warriors as you crush the opposition in fast-paced tactical skirmishes. Throughout your crusade across the galaxy, you can collect and choose from more than 80 fearsome champions spread across 18 playable factions, each with their own unique capabilities that'll expand and complement your playstyle. We're talking the likes of Marnius Calgar, Abaddon the Despoiler, and High Marshal Helbrecht, just to name a few. And then, once you've got your dream team together, you can put them to the test in a variety of challenging game modes, including live events, guild wars, PvP skirmishes, and so much more. So, whether you're a longtime fan of the Warhammer franchise or just getting started, Tacticus is sure to keep you dishing out the Emperor's justice for hours on end. And the developers are always rolling out new updates to keep the experience fresh and exciting. Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus is currently available on both Android and iOS, and right now they're offering Nerd Explains viewers like yourself 2,000 gold, 50 black stones, and a requisition order when you use the code HELLOJAN before February 1st. Link to download is in the pinned comment below. And besides, it's not like the big squid is committed to airtight OPSEC. Last season, they literally dropped 200 eyewitnesses back onto the street just because a majority of them voted to end the games early. That's not something that you would do if you're worried about getting caught. And even if most of them kept their mouths shut just because they were secretly thinking about coming back, you can bet that there's still a pretty sizable chunk that would go straight to the police. Okay, one person reporting their involvement in a secret underground death tournament is mental illness. 2 is a coincidence, but 20, 30, 50 plus, all independently saying the same thing took place over the exact same time frame. That's gonna turn some heads. That is, of course, unless those same heads have been handsomely paid off to look the other way. So now let's look at the other side of the equation. Gi-hun's got more than enough money to buy all the small arms and ammunition he could ever possibly need. He could hire mercenaries, private detectives, pay pilots to conduct flyovers of nearby islands, bribe public officials to give him access to local CCTV cameras, and even spin up a swarm of high-end drones to scan the streets for any sign of recruitment activities. None of that changes the fact that he'll be utterly powerless to stop the games. I mean, the only reason a bunch of psychopaths would let a guy like Gi-hun walk away with 45.6 billion won is because that's probably chump change to them. They can hire more gunmen, pay off more politicians, and set up more surveillance than he could ever possibly dream of. But even then, none of that matters. At the end of the day, even if our hero somehow manages to derail the games and destroy the entire facility, there's no getting rid of the demand that started it all in the first place. We know from Gi-hun's meeting with one of the founders that the games were created by a handful of rich dudes who all got bored one day and figured that it would be fun to watch people die. And boy, were they right. Thing is, there's no way of telling who these people are, where they are, or how many of them there are. And I can only imagine that they've been selling exclusive pay-per-view access as an additional means of financing the operation. That's what I would do at least. Anyway, my point is that unless Gi-hun wipes out virtually everyone involved in both the production and the consumption of the games, someone else will inevitably step in to meet the demand, and the carnage will continue. Like it or not, an undertaking of this nature would require nation-state level funding and near global cooperation, and even then, it'd still be near impossible to stamp out completely due to the sheer amount of money and influence at play. No, if our guy really wants to make a difference, he should do whatever he can to grow his newly acquired wealth in the hopes that he can eventually buy his way behind the curtain. From there, he'll have a much better chance of digging up sensitive information, client lists, suppliers, major sources of funding, and by then, he'll ideally have the kind of connections and assets required to act on a much larger and more decisive scale. But alas, it seems Gi-hun hasn't thought that far ahead, or even thought ahead at all, which is why he's currently on the phone with a member of Squid Inc., explaining that he's going to come looking for them, cause, you know, who needs the element of surprise, right? For real though, what makes you think that they're not just gonna come out and blow your head off the first chance that they get? Sure, you might have found that tracker that they slipped under your skin, but even without real-time access to your every move, they still have your face, your name, your known creditors, and all your identifying information. Meanwhile, all Gi-hun has on them is a hastily drawn sketch of the talent scout that he met back on the subway. And while that's certainly not nothing, it's hardly the kind of lead that I would expect to crack this one wide open anytime soon. After all, there's over 9.6 million people living in Seoul, and on average, more than half that amount will ride the subway every single day. Nevertheless, 2 years and God knows how much money later, our hero still has hired goons conducting daily patrols at every subway station in town. And thus far, not a single one of them has seen any indication that the man that they're looking for even exists. Then again, it might have something to do with the uniquely subtle and nuanced manner by which they've been approaching this assignment. Yeah, that's not gonna scare them off at all. Besides, even if they find this guy, what happens next? They can't just hold him there against his will. He'll call the cops, and it's not like he's gonna lead them back to his secret lair after they dump his shit on the ground. In fact, if I didn't know better, I'd say these schlubs were deliberately going about this manhunt in the most ham-fisted way possible just to keep the paychecks coming in. Gi-hun's not gonna know the difference. That being said, I don't think that their lack of professionalism is the issue here. At the end of the day, they barely know what this guy looks like, and there's no telling whether Squid Corp might have swapped him out for someone else or even changed up their recruitment strategy altogether. What we do know is that the big bads are out here looking for a bunch of sad sacks desperate enough to sign up on the dotted line. So how about we give them some? All we have to do is round up a bunch of rough-looking people down on their luck and pay them to cruise around on the subway for a few hours each day. They don't have to know why. In fact, it's actually better that they don't, to avoid stirring up the same kind of show. Instead, we'll have one of our guys tail each one of them from a distance, where they can call in any squid activity without getting spotted. Of course, we know from Gi-hun's recruitment that the selection process isn't entirely random. Back in Season 1, the recruiter already knew our guy's name and the full extent of his financial situation before making contact. So there's a pretty solid chance that they take that approach for everyone. Lucky for us, the guy we hired to orchestrate the search effort is actually a brutal loan shark whose primary clientele fit the profile perfectly. As a matter of fact, Mr. Kim himself even remarked that a bunch of his debtors had actually been going missing around the same time over the last few years, presumably because they were being swept up by the games. Knowing this, we can round up a few of his most desperate lendees and give them a chance to work off their respective debts by hanging around the city's various public transit systems. And while we're at it, we can even spot them some extra won with the instructions to blow it all at local sports books, as this kind of activity would make them appear even more hard up for cash than they already are, especially if they lose. Basically, the idea would be to replicate the kind of bind Gi-hun was in back when he got scooped up. Dead up to the eyeballs, massive gambling addiction, disheveled and unkempt appearance, the whole 9 yards. There's still no guarantee it'll actually work given the sheer size of the South Korean population, but I gotta believe that it'd have a better chance of getting results than whatever the hell this is. And yet, by some absolute miracle, Mr. Kim and his associate Woo Sok eventually stumble upon an individual matching the target description while out on patrol, so I guess it all worked out in the end. That said, it still took them 2 whole years worth of Gi-hun's money to do so, which is definitely a lot more than it should have considering what this recruiter does in his spare time. Seems like a perfectly well-adjusted human being. Anyway, now that we've found this weirdo, what do we do with him? Well, Gi-hun wants the boys to keep tabs on him while he races towards their position. Apparently, the plan is to ambush the recruiter with nothing but a single Glock pistol, at which point I'm assuming that they'll lean on him for more information. Here's the thing though, you can't do that in public as that'll undoubtedly get the cops involved. And even if you manage to jump him in a secluded place like an alley or something, there's no telling whether he actually has any information that'll get us closer to the organizers. After all, these guys clearly go to great lengths to conceal the identity of everyone involved. So one would expect them to compartmentalize their operation as much as possible and only share details on a need-to-know basis. So what does this guy need to know? He needs to know the names, faces, and financial details of potential players. He needs to know that they'll be playing games in exchange for fabulous cash prizes. And he needs to know where to send them once they agree to play. And that's pretty much it. Sure, we find out later that the recruiter's history with the games goes a lot deeper than that. But for all Gi-hun and company know at the moment, dude's basically just a well-dressed errand boy who could easily be receiving both his instructions and his payment anonymously via dead drop. With that in mind, the better move would be to tail him and try to collect as much information as possible. Where does he live? Who does he interact with? Are there any places outside his home that he visits regularly? If we're lucky, he might lead us back to some kind of handler that we can target to find out even more. Otherwise, the next best thing would be to shadow him while he's handing out invitations, and then follow the prospective players to see where they're being taken. As a matter of fact, that last strat is how Detective Hwang Jun-ho managed to infiltrate the games during Season 1, so it's very likely that that could work. And while our guys couldn't possibly know about that, it's not exactly rocket science. At any rate, it's unclear what exactly Gi-hun has planned once he has the suit at gunpoint, but unfortunately, we'll never find out, as overzealous Mr. Kim decides he and Woo-sok need to take the initiative and bag this scumbag so they can cash in on that billion-won bonus that they were promised. Except, why though? You already had it, you morons. All you had to do was stay on him and keep relaying his position to the boss. It was as simple as that. Instead, you risk compromising the entire operation and losing this dude forever if he somehow manages to get away. Or worse, getting yourselves knocked the f*** out because it turns out you've completely underestimated him. This brings us to the unofficial first game of Squid Game Season 2, Rock, Paper, Roulette. The rules are simple. Each round, the players will engage in two-handed rock, paper, scissors, wherein they will simultaneously reveal symbols in both hands and then take back one hand each to determine which symbols are ultimately played. The loser will then be subjected to roulette involving a Smith & Wesson revolver loaded with a single cartridge. This will continue until one of the players is dead or the recruiter simply gets bored. Now, right off the bat, an obvious game-breaking strategy would be for Mr. Kim and Woo-sok to play the same two symbols in both hands every time, thereby ensuring that each round of RPS ends in a draw. Of course, were I running this show, a draw would mean that they're both losers, and as such would each be subject to their own individual spins from the revolver, but apparently their host is a bit of a softie. In any case, the first issue would be coordinating this approach as they're both being gagged. But given there's only one bullet in the 6-shot revolver and he spins the cylinder before each trigger pull, there's a good chance that we'd live long enough to communicate this to the other player through a combination of head movements and by playing the same two symbols every time. Problem is, even if executed successfully, this will only forestall the inevitable. Game or not, the recruiter almost certainly does not intend for either of us to survive. We've both seen his face, we know he's criminally insane, and probably figures that we were targeting him because we know about the games. So if anything, this is just a means of determining who dies now and who gets brutally tortured to death for more information. Knowing this, I can only imagine he'll impose some kind of time limit once he figures out what we're doing, at which point, we'll have no other choice but to play the game for real. And yes, I know I just said we're probably dead no matter what, but the way I see it, we'll have a better chance of turning the tables the longer we live. So we might as well get this over with right away. Unfortunately, there's no surefire way of winning rock, paper, scissors, but there are a few ways in which we can hedge our bets. First of all, we need to understand that while each symbol has an equal chance of being played, theoretically, in practice, that simply isn't the case. Human beings are notoriously bad at behaving randomly, which is why rock is the most commonly used sign, used at more than 35% of the time according to ReptonGames.com. Evidently, paper is a close second, with scissors sitting at under 30%. As for why this is, there's a couple possible explanations. One is that players are more likely to throw rock because their hands are already in the rock configuration during the count. There's also some evidence that suggests players who are angry or frustrated are more likely to play rock, either for the reason mentioned previously, or because the clenched fist is a more natural response to stress. And finally, there's reason to believe that the name of the game, rock, paper, scissors, subconsciously primes players to choose rock because that's the first symbol mentioned. Here's the thing though, in South Korea, rock, paper, scissors is called gawibawibo, which roughly translates to scissors, rock, paper. Now, I didn't see any data on the rates these symbols were used in Korea, but I'd be willing to bet that scissors is used a bit more frequently because of the change in order. So, what does that mean for us? Well, assuming our hypothesis is correct, our opponent is probably going to start with either rock, rock, or rock, scissors, so we'll play rock, paper. Obviously, in the former case, we'd have a guaranteed win with paper, but if he plays the latter, then we'll keep rock out to ensure that we'll either win or draw depending on which hand he pulls back. Now, at this point, we'll want to start changing which symbols we use depending on the outcome of the previous round. Generally speaking, people are more likely to fall back on something that's been shown to work. So if our opponent wins a round, there's a good chance that he'll play the same combo again. And if he loses, he'll probably switch to the symbols that we picked for the very same reason. As for which hand we pull back, that again depends on the previous winner. So if he plays rock, paper, and wins by keeping paper in, we'll play rock, scissors next round, and keep scissors in to hopefully seal the deal. Essentially, all we have to do is make sure our combo contains the symbol that would beat the previous winner, along with the symbol that loses to the previous winner to ensure that they have a reason to play it again in the first place. In the event of a draw, we'll replay the same throw, and if it's still a draw, we'll switch to whatever would lose to the repeated symbol. Statistically, players are far more likely to switch after throwing the same thing twice, so at that point, it's more likely that we'll either win or draw again than lose. And no, I see no point in descending down the rabbit hole of predicting his next move based on what he might think our next move would be, as this inevitably leads to an infinite loop of potential decisions that could easily stall us out. Besides, it's not like he's got time to think the way things are moving at a breakneck pace. Dude's gonna do what comes naturally to him, especially once the recruiter cranks things up to 11 with the addition of 4 more cartridges.
Rock, paper, scissors!
Ooh, yeah. Suffice to say, you really don't want to throw the same 2 symbols when you're playing for real, as this leaves you entirely at your opponent's mercy. Lucky for Woosock, he's playing against an old friend, and one that would apparently take a bullet for him. Because of this, Mr. Kim chooses not to pull back either hand when prompted by the recruiter, resulting in his immediate removal from the game, and also life. What a guy. Anyway, we jump back to Gi-hun's rundown motel hideout just as our hero returns home empty-handed. Or so he thinks. I guess 2 years worth of consistent wages paid out in cash don't exactly buy loyalty. Although in this case, that's actually a good thing. After all, now he's got the sales creep alone and on his own turf where no one can hear him scream. However, instead of immediately drawing his concealed Glock and holding the intruder at gunpoint, Gi-hun inexplicably allows himself to get roped into yet another deadly game of chance. Merry go boom. The rules are simple. I mean, really simple. It's just roulette. 1 round in the gun, give it a spin, squeeze, and hope you don't wake up in Skyrim.
Finally awake.
Except this time, they won't be rotating the cylinder between turns, which means there's only a maximum of 6 trigger pulls before somebody gets a mouthful. Now, in terms of strats, we can easily determine whether the gun is about to fire by examining the front of the cylinder. Smith & Wesson revolvers always rotate counterclockwise from the shooter's perspective, i.e. clockwise from the target's perspective. When the hammer's pulled back, either manually or by pressing the trigger double action, the cylinder rotates one position before being ready to fire. This means that as long as the bullet isn't showing in the 10 o'clock position before we cock the hammer, there's no chance that it'll go off. And if it is, well, then we know exactly when to stop playing fair. Oh, yeah, we could also just step back from the table, point it at the recruiter's face, and slap the trigger 6 times deer hunter style to show him what a terrible idea this was. But no, as always, it couldn't possibly be that easy.
If you do, though, you'll have to admit one thing to me. You're trash and just as worthless as everyone else.
Okay, sounds good to me. For real, though. It's not like there's anyone else to hear it. And even if there were, so what? Right now, you have the perfect opportunity to ice this clown. Take the invitation from his pocket and use it to try and stop the games, just like you've been planning for 2 whole years. Are you really gonna let something as trivial as pride get in the way of that? Moreover, are you really about to sacrifice the hundreds, if not thousands of lives that you could potentially save just to protect your fragile little ego? Apparently the answer is yes, as Gi-hun triumphantly bets the house on a 50-50 shot and squeezes trig. And while the gamble does go his way, he then proceeds to double down on the insanity by handing the loaded revolver back to the evil bad guy, knowing full well the next shot is guaranteed to go off. Awesome. And sure, I suppose it's possible Gi-hun didn't think the recruiter would actually be dumb enough to let him turn the tables like that. Maybe he thought the barrel was blocked and the piece was loaded with eldest son ammo. Who knows? That still doesn't change the fact that our guy had a loaded handgun tucked into his waistband that he could have easily deployed at any time. In fact, were I in his shoes, I would have had that thing out under the table the second we both sat down. Then, once I had the revolver and could see both of his hands, there's only one thing left to do.
See how feed us into your Nazi boss.
Simple as. Credit where it's due, however. It was immensely satisfying to watch the recruiter guy eat his own words at 1,200 feet per second. That's right, the crazy actually went through with it. Guess he really liked games. Anyway, now that Gi-hun finally has his golden ticket, it's just a matter of figuring out how in the world he can possibly use it to his advantage. I mean, it's not like he'll be able to take any kind of meaningful action as one of the players. And even if he somehow managed to escape his imprisonment, he's only one man up against God knows how many pink dudes. Or is he? As luck would have it, it turns out former police detective Jun-ho somehow managed to survive getting blown off a cliff back in season 1. And while he might have put his mission on hold for the past couple years, that all changed the moment he saw Gi-hun's name on a speeding ticket. This development would ultimately bring him down to the no-tell motel, just in time to tragically misread the situation. However, just as he's about to slap the cuffs on our guy and haul him in on murder charges, who else but Woo-Suk would swoop in at the very last second to change his mind.
Anything you say can
Yup, changed his mind from on to off. Fortunately for everyone involved, Jun-ho winds up surviving the TBI he just received and goes on to make a full recovery. And after a brief explanation as to why there's a man in Gi-hun's living room missing the top of his head, he decides to throw away what's left of his career in law enforcement and join in on the revenge plot. As for Woo-Suk, we come to find out the man is more than just the comic relief. Dude's got connections with former special ops guys that they can call on to put a small team together. Couple this with the entire bathroom full of guns and ammo that Gi-hun's collected over the years, and they'll have just enough firepower to die screaming in a pile of hot brass. Like it or not, there's no amount of training that can make up for the fact that they'll be going in blind against armed adversaries with an overwhelming numerical advantage. Worse yet, their plan is to go after the so-called VIPs that keep the games running. And you gotta believe those guys are gonna have a serious security detail around them at all times, especially after Jun-ho near did one of them a couple years back. No, a team like this is only equipped for something like reconnaissance or maybe even sabotage. But on the positive side, either of those two options could still be incredibly useful. Think about it. If all we're trying to do is nail a handful of rich a-holes, what's the point of launching a full-scale assault on the entire base? The way I see it, a far better approach would be to hit them out in the open while they're going to and from the games. So what if instead we set up some surveillance positions both on the island itself and on the neighboring islands to see if we can spot them during the transit? Based on Junho's experience back in 2020, the VIPs will all arrive together while the whole thing's already underway. And while it's unclear whether he would have known that they came in via helicopter, there's not too many ways that they could reach the island that would go unnoticed. I mean, maybe a submarine, sure, but these guys are all about luxury, so if they don't come in on a helo, it'll probably be a fancy yacht. In any case, once we identify their mode of transportation, we could attempt to rig it with explosives and light them up over open water. Or simply wait until they get back on board and hit it with an FPV drone. Obviously, the latter comes with a lot less risk, but there's no telling whether they might have some kind of active countermeasures in place to fend off nosy drone operators. Really, it'll just have to come down to the situation. If Big Squid leaves the helicopter lightly guarded and our guys think that they can reach it undetected, then we do it the old-fashioned way. Same with a yacht, if we can reach it with scuba gear. But if the security's too tight, or if the vehicle drops the VIPs off to pick them up later, we'll send in the drones. Several of them. Gi-hun can definitely afford it. And if all else fails, there is one last thing that we can try, as a sort of Hail Mary play. Again, looking back on Junho's previous infiltration attempt, he ultimately fled the compound via the VIP emergency exit tunnel that led down to the water. It wouldn't necessarily be easy to find given it lets out underwater, but assuming we did, we could place a couple guys there as a stop group to cut off their escape. And at the very least, we could always sabotage their dive packs so they run out of air halfway to the surface. But of course, none of this matters unless we find the island. Which brings us to phase 1 of our hero's foolproof plan. It all starts with a back alley dentist swapping out one of Gi-hun's molars with a tracking device. Apparently, the whole idea is for him to get picked up by the organizers, at which point the mercs will home in on their location and capture the leader, the mysterious frontman. Now, this is incredibly stupid for several reasons, not the least of which is the fact that Gi-hun already made it quite clear that he intends to shut the games down by any means necessary. So it's entirely likely the invitation he received was just a trick to lure him into the crosshairs. All I can say is that our guy better come up with one hell of a cover story, or else this little limo ride will probably end behind a dumpster somewhere.
What do you want from me?
To stop the game once and for all.
Oh boy. Seriously, you couldn't make something up to at least try and throw them off? I don't know, maybe tell them you thought about it over the last couple of years and you've decided you want to become a part of the organization that changed your life for the better. And as for the recruiter, well, things just got out of hand. You know, your henchman jumped the gun, one thing led to another, and he wound up losing his head. It happens. If nothing else, he could have said that he became hopelessly addicted to the thrill of the games and has been chasing that rush ever since. I mean, just about anything's better than an open threat in this situation, right? It probably wouldn't matter either way, as the two vans full of military-aged men following the limo, turn for turn, were bound to betray his true intentions eventually. And sure enough, a pink-clad marksman up on a nearby roof knocks out both pursuit vehicles just as they're about to make their play. And with Junho's car having been sabotaged with a small explosive device, it suddenly becomes clear to our hero that nobody's coming to save him. Realizing this, Gi-hun attempts to salvage the operation the only way he knows how, by asking to participate in the games. And with that, the knockout gas is deployed, and the nightmare begins. So where exactly did this plan go wrong? Well, if I had to guess, it was probably the moment that they thought there was even the slightest chance that the front man might actually show up in person. We're talking about the one man who controls literally every aspect of the games. Do you honestly think that he would stick his neck out like that? Again, knowing that Gi-hun had previously vowed to come after him. And then there's the execution. Remember, our guy had a tracking device in his mouth that allowed the others to see his location in real time. Now, I'm no expert here, but as I understand it, the benefit of a tracking device is that it allows you to know where something is without following it directly behind it. This means the intercept team could have easily stayed much further back, or even on parallel streets, while still knowing exactly where to go. However, all this is beside the fact that their objective doesn't seem to align all that well with their long-term goal of taking out the VIPs. Alright, let's say everything went exactly according to plan. Frontman is now their prisoner and Gi-hun made it out safely. Well, they still wouldn't know where the island is, and I can only imagine the big bad would rather die than give up his location. After all, just look at what happened with the recruiter. Furthermore, Junho still hasn't made the big reveal that this frontman is actually his brother. The very same brother who knowingly shot him and let him fall off of a cliff to what could have easily been certain death. Point is, dude's clearly all in for the games at this point, so it's a pretty safe bet that he won't do much talking. And on top of all that, what do you think is going to happen to the games when the man in charge is a no-show? Don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's some kind of procedure in place to determine a successor, but if the powers that be find out that he was captured, they might very well call this year off over security concerns, and that means no VIPs. Okay, granted, that last part was purely speculation, but no matter how things ultimately played out, I don't think compromising their entire operation with a brazen public kidnapping was ever gonna work in our guys' favor. Instead, the plan from the very beginning should have been for Gi-hun to try and talk his way back into the games, so the mercs could follow him out to the island using the tracking device. To that end, I would have had a much smaller, less conspicuous pursuit vehicle follow the limo out from a significant distance to see where it wound up. Best case scenario, they take him straight to the same vessel that they're using to transport the rest of the players. Of course, there's no guarantee it'll go down like that, but either way, we'll want to have another team waiting offshore in a blacked out speedboat that can pursue should the need arise. Worst case scenario, they load him into something that blocks the tracker's GPS signal and give us the slip somehow before departing for the island. If that happens, we'll be pretty much hosed. After all, as Junho should know firsthand, the players are taken deep underground within minutes of their arrival, and I can only imagine a couple hundred feet of rock and steel would make it basically impossible to get any kind of signal out once Gi-hun's inside. Couple this with the fact that there's more than 3,300 islands off the coast of South Korea, and the team could easily wind up searching all year without ever even getting close. That said, they do seemingly have one small advantage in that Junho was supposedly rescued by a local fisherman somewhere within drifting distance of the target location. So, should the worst come to pass, they'd still have a rough idea of where the island might be. Well, maybe. You see, prior to his involvement with this outfit, Junho spent the last couple years returning to the same general area where he was allegedly fished out. And yet, despite his best efforts, he never found so much as a trace of Squid Game activity. Now, if I had to guess, this is because the old fisherman simply forgot where he actually found the man and has since been taking him out to the wrong area. It's either that, or he's been deliberately leading him astray this entire time for some reason. Who knows? He could be getting paid by the hour. Whatever the case, there's still one last thing that we can try and hedge our bets with. Like I said earlier, Junho previously managed to infiltrate the island by sneaking aboard the car ferry after a majority of Season 1's players elected to return to the games. Now, there's no telling whether Squid Corp ultimately figured this out and either beefed up security or changed staging areas. But all the same, it'd be worth heading back out to the same location to see if we could pull it off a second time. Needless to say, Having a handful of Korean Navy SEALs posing as pink dudes would be a pretty big asset to our operation. I mean, just think about how much Junho was able to dig up on his own. Plus, they might be able to help Gi-hun out from time to time or even spring him from the games entirely. Oh yeah, speaking of Gi-hun, he'd better be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice here, because if he can't convince a majority of players to end the games early, the chances of him making it out alive a second time are not super great. Then again, between his willingness to hop in the front man's limo and his original plan of going in guns blazing, he's probably already made peace with this fact. And if not, well, he better start praying, because it turns out the organizers found that tracker he was wearing before they ever even left the mainland. Although, to be honest, I can't really say I'm surprised. Obviously, they were going to take every precaution they could after last night's little show. And that would have had to include sweeping for bugs. See, the problem with using a tracking device like that is that it emits a constant signal, something which anyone could easily detect so long as they had the right equipment. Not saying it was a bad idea or anything, but for redundancy's sake, it would have been wise for Gi-hun to swallow a second transmitter that would remain inactive until after it was recovered. Oh well, too late for that now. And since our hero only made this discovery after signing the consent form, it seems the only option he has left is to buckle in and play the feud. This brings us to the first official game of Squid Game Season 2, Red Light, Green Light, or as I like to call it, don't get shot with a bullet. The rules are simple. Players must reach the finish line on the opposite side of the arena before the time runs out. Thing is, they're only allowed to move during a green light when the doll at the end is facing away, and anyone caught moving once the red light is called will immediately be shot dead with an HK PSG-1. Unfortunately, only Gi-hun knows about that last part, as Red Light Green Light was also the first game played back in Season 1. With that in mind, he immediately jumps out in front of the pack to inform his fellow players of the imminent danger. But as I'm sure you can probably imagine, there's just about no one who actually believes him. Nevertheless, Gi-hun's well-timed commands managed to keep everyone breathing for a lot longer than they likely would have otherwise. Of course, when you're talking about a group of 456 people, you know it's only a matter of time before at least one of them gets careless. And that's when the screaming starts.
I just moved, didn't I?
And so it begins. Naturally, the first instinct of many is to try and run away, but as we all know, you can't outrun a bullet. Especially when there's nowhere to actually run. You see, the doors were locked behind the players once they entered the arena, which means no one's getting out of here unless they shut up and play the game. Lucky for us, that game is Red Light, Green Light. Sure, they might have added a few extra frills here and there, but aside from all that, it's still the same painfully easy children's game that so many of us grew up playing. The key thing to remember here is that the snipers are not your enemy. Well, they kind of are, but the real enemy is inertia. The faster you're moving, the longer it'll take you to stop. So the last thing that we want to do is take off sprinting. Instead, when the green light is called, we'll move forward at a fast walking pace with a wide gait and our knees slightly bent to help us maintain our balance. We'll also want to keep our arms down and barely take our feet off the ground while moving, as this will ensure we don't get stuck with any outstretched limbs that might be difficult to hold still for prolonged periods. Doing all of this will allow us to stop very quickly at any point in our stride, which means we can continue moving forward at the same constant pace without having to waste time slowing ourselves down. Oh, and definitely try to avoid going near the bodies on the ground. There's a chance they might not be dead yet, which would make stepping over them a potential trip hazard should they suddenly try and get back up. Plus, they might also try and grab onto you for help, which will almost certainly end poorly. As for the time limit, we have 5 minutes to cover a distance of maybe 100 yards. So as long as we get in a good 2 or 3 steps per second, we could probably have the whole thing nailed in roughly a minute of green light time. We might not come in first place, but at least we'll be alive. And right now, that's all that really matters. One thing's for sure though, I would not form up into columns as Gi-hun suggests, as this only creates an opportunity for bad actors or clumsy oafs to kill a whole bunch of people at once with a single push, kinda like this. Furthermore, A bullet can easily pass through multiple bodies depending on its design, weight, and velocity, which means we could easily catch a collateral from someone close to us moving on a red. And even though the whole idea was to have small players hide behind larger ones to conceal any movements from the doll's motion sensors, that doesn't really apply to everyone, and it shouldn't even matter so long as we're playing correctly. In any case, Gi-hun's coaching undoubtedly made a huge difference, as by the end, only 91 players were killed in comparison to the 255 that bought it during the first game of Season 1. Here's the thing though, I get that Gi-hun wants to save as many people as he possibly can whenever he possibly can. It's simply in his nature. But at the end of the day, the only way any of these people are walking out of this mess, himself included, is if the majority of them vote to end the games early. To that end, I think it would have actually been a better choice for him to keep his mouth shut and let nature take its course. Fact is, the more players that die right off the bat, the more hopeless this whole situation's gonna seem to everybody else. And yeah, 91 people is not a small amount by any stretch of the imagination, but a raw number doesn't hit nearly as hard as the realization that over half of you were killed in the first game alone. Now, on the other hand, more players getting eliminated also means more money dropping down into the piggy bank right before voting. It comes out to 100 million won per person, or at least under 69,000 US dollars. So even a single death translates to a life-changing amount of money for the average player. Multiply that by a couple hundred, and you'll never have to work another day in your life. It'd be enticing for sure, and if someone's already got nothing left to lose, why not give it a shot? Still, it's worth pointing out that the last time around, a slim majority voted to leave after Game 1, despite the total prize amount reaching over 17.5 million US dollars. And while those were different people, and it's only a single data point, it stands to reason that our best chance at replicating the outcome is to recreate the conditions as closely as possible. Moreover, we come to find out the organizers made a slight change to the rules surrounding this subject. You see, whereas before, players would have to forfeit any accumulated earnings should they vote to end the games early. Now, the amount is to be divided equally amongst those who are still alive. Because of this, had we lost the same amount of players as before, each of the survivors would be able to walk away with more than $87,000 each. And sure, there would almost certainly be some who wanted to stick it out, but I think between the high casualty rates and the promise of what likely amounts to more than a year's wages for most of them, the overwhelming majority would choose to take the money and run. Instead, because we only lost 91 players, the split comes to just over $17,000 each, which is still plenty of money, for sure. But if you thought you could double, triple, or even quadruple it by hanging on for just one more round, would you do it? Apparently, 183 of these people would say yes, and so it is decided that the madness will continue. For you see, like any good democracy, Squid Game respects its players' freedom of choice, just so long as their choice aligns with what's most popular. And yes, I understand that Gi-hun couldn't have possibly known about the rule change going into this mess. And hell, it's entirely possible the organizers made it up on the spot to try and influence the vote. But all the same, dude should have known better than to try and play the hero. Now, not only will more players inevitably die in the ensuing rounds, Gi-hun will also have to explain how he knew about the snipers ahead of time, and we already know how that's gonna go.
I was here 3 years ago, and I played them all!
Look, man, I get it. The truth has its uses for sure, but so do lies. And in this case, you really should have gone with the latter. By telling everyone you've already won once before, all you're gonna do is embolden them. They're gonna take one look at you and think to themselves that if this fairly unassuming guy could do it, why couldn't they? And that very same notion is going to keep pushing them forward for as long as they're still alive. Moreover, you've also just painted a colossal target right on your back. Now, anyone who's seriously thinking about winning is going to view you as a potential threat, which means they'll probably try and take you out as soon as it's convenient, possibly even outside one of the games. Meanwhile, all you had to say was that you saw one of the snipers off in the distance, or that you overheard some of the pink dudes talking about it, or maybe that you know someone who played the game before and voted their way out. In fact, that last one might even help you win over some of the black pillars out there that think that the vote doesn't matter. And sure, maybe the organizers would call them out on the Jumbotron like they did with some of the other participants, but it certainly doesn't hurt to try. Anyway, now that the cat's out of the bag, Gihun's got a whole bunch of people hitting him up for tips on how to handle the next game. After all, if the first one was the same as before, why wouldn't the others be too? Spoiler alert, they are not. Almost as soon as they enter the next arena, our hero realizes something is off. First of all, the room is significantly larger than it would need to be for Dalgona, even if you account for the extra players. And while last season, Game 2 was an individual challenge, this time around, the hosts started off by having them break out into teams of 5. Of course, without knowing what the game will be, it's difficult to say who will want to pick for Team Nerd. With all this space, it looks like it could easily be something more on the physical side. But given what we've seen in the past, they could just as easily have us building a house of cards. Gotta do something though. So here's what I'm thinking. As long as someone isn't a complete knucklehead or traumatized beyond the point of being useful, most of the previous games have been simple enough that we could probably teach them how to play if we absolutely had to. What you can't teach someone, however, is raw athleticism. At least not in 2 minutes. So I say we lean more on the physical attributes when picking out our teammates. Unfortunately for Gihun, his failure to accurately predict the second game cost him quite a bit of credibility. But all the same, he still manages to put together a fairly solid team. We've got a seemingly athletic dude of roughly the same age, 2 former Marines, and a pregnant chick. Guess we'll just have to hope the fact that she's playing for 2 will be enough to push her over the edge. At any rate, it turns out this next round is more about skill and experience than anything else. So f*** me, I guess. The name of the game is the 6-legged pentathlon, but I prefer Rainbow Roadkill. Before starting, players will be joined together at the ankles, effectively creating 6 legs for them to coordinate. From there, 2 teams at a time will enter the multicolored racetrack, wherein they'll have 5 minutes to make it all the way around. However, at each 10-meter interval, 1 player from each team will have to complete a brief minigame before they're allowed to continue. Keep in mind, the teams aren't actually competing against one another, they're simply racing the clock. So as long as both groups make it across the finish line before their time is up, all 10 players will remain in the game. Otherwise, this will happen. No pressure, right? Now, for the sake of time, I'll break down the best practices for completing each minigame as I introduce them. First up is Dakji, aka Get Rotated. The object of this game is to flip over a folded paper square by slamming it with an identical paper square of your own. However, in practice, it's a little more complicated than that. See, the trick is to ensure your square lands flat on top of the target square, thereby maximizing the surface area of the point of contact. Doing so causes the entirety of the target to absorb the greatest amount of energy possible, which is then transmitted to the floor, thus propelling the target square upward high enough to achieve a full rotation. Of course, like anything else, it's all in the technique. To start, you want to hold your square with your thumb on the bottom and fingers on the top. You then want to widen your stance with your dominant foot angled back and your non-dominant foot placed beside the target. Now, at this point, you're going to want to keep your eyes focused dead center on the target square. Ideally, the side with the folds will be facing upwards, as this will provide a fixed point of aim directly in the middle. Once you're ready to throw, bring your throwing hand up to about shoulder level with your elbow cocked above your head, and then swing your arm downward in a forceful yet controlled fashion. The release will take place fairly close to the ground, and if done correctly, the square will flip. Simple as that. So next up we have Flying Stone, or rock and stone if you're a man of culture. Honestly, this one seems pretty simple. All you have to do is knock over the little tombstone thing placed several yards away by hitting it with a flat rock. Here's the thing though, if you miss your throw, you'll have to retrieve your stone before returning to the starting position. Ordinarily, this wouldn't be a problem, but when you're all chained together, going back and forth like that becomes a huge drain on time. To mitigate this, we'll want to throw the stone underhand so that it falls flat onto the ground. Kind of like you're throwing a beanbag in cornhole. This'll prevent the throwing stone from erratically bouncing farther away in the event of a miss, which still wouldn't be great, mind you, but at least you'd be able to shave a little bit off the delay. Now, while throwing, we'll want to keep our eyes fixed on one of the little symbols adorning the tombstone. Just like Dakchi, it's all about aim small, miss small. So the more precise our point of aim, the better chance we have at landing a solid hit. Keep in mind, however, a solid hit doesn't necessarily mean we're trying to blow the thing to pieces. With as narrow as the base is on the tombstone, we'll barely have to touch it to knock it over. So there's no point in straight up launching it like this guy does.
Everything!
And sure, in this case it happened to work out for him, but if it hadn't, both he and his entire team would have been totally SOL. All that is to say, it's much better to underthrow in this situation than overthrow. And besides, if the stone lands just in front of the target, there's always a chance that it could still bounce forward a little bit and knock it over. As for the throwing stance, we'll want to keep our non-dominant foot forward in typical throwing fashion, so it'll be best to have any players on our dominant side angled backwards slightly to allow for this. And speaking of the other players, their primary responsibility will be watching our forward foot to make sure that we don't step over the line, as doing so will nullify a successful throw. Moving on to our next challenge, we have Gongi, or Jumping Jacks. This minigame is composed of 5 rounds with varying degrees of difficulty. In round 1, you'll first scatter the 5 provided jacks on the small table in front of you. You'll then pick one up, throw it in the air, and grab another one off the table while also catching the one you just tossed up in the same hand. Repeat this process until you've collected all 5 jacks and the round is over. However, if at any point you fail to catch the tossed jack, drop one of the jacks you've already collected, or touch more than one jack while trying to pick one up, you'll have to start all over from the very beginning. Because of that last part, we'll want to try and scatter the jacks as much as possible while dumping them on the table to ensure that we don't accidentally touch more than one with our big, stupid butcher's hand. The rest is primarily a matter of having quick reflexes and good hand-eye coordination, although we'll also want to make sure that we don't toss the jack above our field of view, or else we might lose track of it. Anyway, once at round 2, we'll be doing something similar, only this time, we'll throw up one jack and pick up the rest in groups of 2. Just like before, we can only use one hand, and we can only touch as many jacks as we need to pick up. So we'll have to be strategic about which one of the jacks that we choose to toss at the beginning of the round. Furthermore, while dropping the jacks in, we'll still want them to be scattered, but not quite as much as in round 1. Keeping them closer together will make it easier to grab them 2 at a time, and that's really important, as the longer it'll take us to pick them up, the higher we'll have to toss the jack to compensate. Round 3 starts off the same as the previous rounds, but this time, we'll start by picking up 3 and then pick up the last one by itself. This time, we'll want to keep the spread pretty tight while dumping them onto the table, so it'd probably be best to simply turn our hand over, just above the surface, and let them gently tumble out. Now, round number 4 starts off a little bit differently. Instead of dumping the jacks on the table at the beginning of the round, we'll start with the jacks still in hand from round 3. This time around, we'll toss one up and place the remaining 4 down on the table. We'll then catch the first jack, toss it up again, and recollect the 4 that we put down. Obviously, the best way to tackle this part is to bring the 4 jacks directly to the table as opposed to letting them drop. In doing so, we'll want to make sure that they stay as close together as possible. Otherwise, we'll have a hell of a time picking them back up before it's too late. And finally, we're at round number 5, which is far and away the most difficult of the series. Starting with all 5 jacks clustered tightly in our hand, the object is to toss them all up at once and then catch them on the backs of our fingers. Naturally, we don't want to toss them very high, as this will only cause them to spread apart further, and the increased velocity might cause them to bounce. In fact, you should barely be able to tell we even tossed them up at all. It just needs to be enough for us to rotate our hand. Also, during the catch, we'll want to fan our fingers ever so slightly to create a wider landing area. Plus, it'll be harder for them to slide off if they get trapped in the spaces. Bonus points if you're double jointed and can hyperextend your fingers to create a sort of spoon-like shape. It's not over yet though, as once we have the jacks on the back of our hand, we'll have to toss them up again and catch them in the overhand grip. Once again, we'll want to just barely get them up in the air to minimize dispersion. At that point, it all comes down to focus, precision, and honestly, luck. Even the people making tutorial videos struggle with this part. At any rate, assuming we make it past all that, we'll be at minigame number 4, Spinning Top, otherwise known as Ye Olde Beyblade. Here, players must successfully wind and throw an old-school spinning top such that it lands on its tip and rotates steadily for a brief period of time. Of course, much like Flying Stone, this one punishes failure with a serious time suck, as the group will have to march down the track to retrieve the top should it fail to properly spin. Moreover, you also have the added time required to rewind the cord, which is arguably the hardest part. So, how do we beat it? Well, assuming we're right-handed, we'll start by holding the top in our left hand with the stem pointed towards us. We then take the knotted end of the cord and hold it against the left side of the stem with our left thumb, such that the knot is resting on the rim of the top at the 12 o'clock position. At that point, we'll wrap the knotted end around the stem clockwise until the knot reaches 5 o'clock. From there, we'll take the long end and bring it under the stem counterclockwise, pinching the knot against the top and then immediately bringing it towards the tip. To clarify, we're not winding the long end all the way around the stem. It just needs to travel far enough to overlap the knot and hold it in place while we finish winding the top. Moving on, we then point the tip to the right, bring the string over to the tip, and then proceed to wind the top from tip to rim in a clockwise motion as viewed from the right. Keep in mind, we'll want to maintain constant tension on the cord while doing this. Letting the line go slack at any point while winding it will likely cause the whole thing to unravel, at which point we'll have to start over again from the tip. So now that our top is properly wound, we take the remaining knotted end and secure it under our right ring finger. We will then transfer the top from our left hand to our right hand, holding it between our right index finger and right thumb with the tip pointing down. At this point, we will enter a throwing stance with our left foot forward. Pick a spot on the floor roughly 4 to 6 feet away, and then throw the top towards said spot by swinging a right arm at the shoulder. And finally, we'll want to maintain a firm grip on the cord after releasing, but we don't want to pull it back. Otherwise, we're liable to whip the thing behind us like Player 1 did during Gihun's run. But yeah, barring any mishaps like that, our team's top should be spinning like a top. Now, of course, if you're a lefty, then you're just going to die, because I'm not walking through all that a second time. We're moving on to minigame number 5. The last one is called Jeggy, but I'm calling it Kick the Tassel Thing. All we gotta do is kick this thing 5 times in a row hacky sack style, and we can finally hobble our way to the finish line. And as far as I can tell, it's really as simple as it sounds. The key is to use the side of your foot to hit the flat face of the Jeggy, thereby ensuring it primarily travels straight up instead of laterally, where it'd be much harder to reach, especially cuffed together like this. Also, we'll want to make sure the Jeggy goes high enough to be falling face down when we kick it again, or else we risk hitting it on its side and sending it off in some random direction. Plus, if we're playing by the official rules, we'll need time for our foot to touch the ground between each kick. And that's about it. All that's left to do now is walk the last 10 meters to the finish line. which we should be able to do with plenty of time left over thanks to our special nerd powers. Lucky for Gi-hun, his teammates each came equipped with a special set of skills required to breeze through every challenge. That is, except for player 1, but more on that later. All I can say is that it's a good god thing the organizers allowed the teams to decide which of their members would play each game. Otherwise, hardly any of them would have made it past Gongji. That one is way harder than it looks. Still, despite getting a chance to play to their strengths, there were more than 100 players who weren't nearly as fortunate as our hero. This brings the count down to 255, while also bringing the prize pool up to just under $14 million. And you know what that means. That's right, the crazy actually voted to keep the party going. And so we move on to game number 3, Mingle. Although I think Mangle is more appropriate given the context. Anyway, the game consists of multiple rounds. At the beginning of each round, players will stand on a rotating platform in the center of the arena. This platform will continue to rotate until the announcer calls out a number, at which point, the players will have 30 seconds to form into groups based on the number called and shut themselves inside one of the rooms surrounding the play area. Failure to do so will result in a giant pizza party for you and all your friends. Nah, they'll actually just shoot you. Anyway, the best strategy for this one is actually pretty simple. It's just a matter of aggressively forcing other players in and out of our group until we achieve the requisite head count. Lucky for us, our hero has already trauma bonded himself with 4 other players, so at least we won't have to worry about starting from scratch. Best case scenario, the first number is 5, in which case all we have to do is run like hell to one of the rooms as soon as the time starts. We definitely can't count on that though, so while the platform is spinning, we need to have each member of our existing team on the lookout for potential add-ons. Of course, with everyone packed in together like this, it'll be difficult to tell who's already on a team, but I gotta believe that any free agents will be looking pretty frantic right now, which will probably make them easier to spot. However, if we're needing to pick up a group of 2 or more, the best time to find them would probably be when the music stops and everyone starts breaking into their pre-established groups. With that in mind, we'll want to circle up as soon as the number is called and start looking for other teams of the appropriate size. Once one is identified, we move together as a group and form around them to fend off any would-be poachers.
What if the number's less than that?
Less than 5, you mean? I'm glad you asked. If the number is 2 or 3, all we have to do is hunt down 1 extra person and then break off into 2 or 3 smaller groups. 4 is a little bit trickier though, as we would have to either find a group of 3 or boot out one of our own. And we all know Gi-hun isn't gonna go for the latter. Still, it wouldn't be the end of the world as long as we're paying attention. And no, at no point should we split up before finding our extra players. It's gonna be absolute chaos out there. And I can pretty much guarantee that there'll be groups fighting over loose players, so we'll want to stick together as much as possible to protect what's ours, and even go on the offensive. It is life or death after all, so if it comes down to it, we need to be prepared to rip someone away from a smaller and/or weaker group and drag them screaming off into one of the rooms. And speaking of the rooms, we'll probably wind up fighting over those at some point too. I mean, think about it. There's only 50 doors spread around the arena, so if at any point the number of total groups exceeds that, there's gonna be a whole lot of desperate people willing to do whatever it takes to get inside one. Knowing this, we'll have to strike a balance between speed and defense. If there's 6 of us and the number is 2, we'll stay together until we get close enough to 3 rooms and then break apart. That said, there's almost certainly going to be cases where the only available rooms are spread far apart. So the moment we have enough players to divide ourselves evenly, we need to start forming subgroups and get ready to run. Now, getting back to the story, the first number that's called is 10, to which our guys respond correctly by seeking out another large pre-established group. Unfortunately, the one that they find only has 4, but with a little quick thinking and violence of action from one of the allied players, they manage to pull in a loner to hit the target. Where they screw up, however, is in their decision to separate from the other team once the round is over. Having a gang of 10 would make it significantly easier and faster to round up other players. If the number's 2, they break into 5 groups and find a room. If it's 3, they find 2 players to make 12 and do 4 groups. 4 is 2 players in 3 groups. 5, they just break into 2 groups. 6, they find 2 players and do 2 groups. 7, 8, and 9 is harder since they would need 4, 6, and 8 respectively to divide into 2 groups, but it's still doable. And of course, if the number's more than 10, they'd already have a huge head start. But now that they've gone back to their original 5, they have to find 3 players to make groups of 4 instead of just 2. Lucky for them, player 1 decides to bow out and save them all some time. But that also increases the likelihood that he'll wind up getting killed and making things even harder for us in the future rounds. Anyway, the other rounds are 3, 6, and 2 respectively, all of which would have been significantly easier had we held on to our 10 stack, which, by the way, would have grown to 12 following the 4-count round. That means all we would have had to do for the last 3 rounds is simply break off into groups and head for a door. And sure, I get that we couldn't have known what the future numbers would be, but worst case scenario, we either boot out the extra players we picked up during the previous round, or grab a couple more depending on whichever's easier. Nevertheless, as the game ends, we see that Gi-hun and all his friends have survived once again. What's more, it turns out the extra $10.7 million in added prize money wasn't enough to pull the majority, but unfortunately, the loss of 155 players wasn't enough either. And so this time around, the vote ends in a tie, meaning the players will have to vote on it again the following day. But hey, that's still a win for Team X, right? The games are now suspended, and assuming no one who voted to end them changes their vote, it's only a matter of time before one of the people on Team O gets tired of waiting and chooses to switch sides. However, there's just one problem. With so much at stake, the tensions between players voting to leave and those voting to stay has created a veritable powder keg waiting to explode. And wouldn't you know it, Big Squid decided to crank things up even further by giving everyone metal forks with their evening meal. All that's left now is for someone to light the fuse. Get forked, idiot. But of course, it doesn't just end with the purple pill popper. The bathroom brawl continues to escalate until 4 more players wind up cashing out. Now, on the one hand, this development gives the X's a slim majority in the vote, but that's not until tomorrow, and you gotta believe the O's are not gonna take this lying down. Knowing this, I think the best option for Team Good Guy would be to prepare a counterattack for multiple sides. As our heroes point out, the O's will almost certainly start creeping over as soon as the lights go out. So if we all tried to do the same, it would just result in a stand-up fight, which is exactly what we want to avoid. Instead, the second it gets dark, we'll have 10 or 15 X's follow the wall on our side towards the main elevator, whereas the rest of us will start moving forward to meet the O's head on. Those that are seriously weak or infirm can curl up out of the way somewhere, but we'll need just about everyone we can get to stay in the fight if we're gonna have any chance of pulling this off. And yeah, I realize it's not exactly pitch black in here with those red and blue lights, but it's still pretty dark. So as long as they move fast enough, the flanking team should be able to get into position before the enemy's eyes can adjust to the darkness. As for our eyes, we'll want to have them closed with our faces covered well before lights out so that our night vision is in a better state prior to showtime. However, even with our eyes properly adjusted, distinguishing friend from foe is still going to be a serious challenge when things get crazy. Fact is, one tiny patch worn on the chest simply isn't enough in low light conditions, so it'd probably be best for us to remove our tracksuit tops altogether. Not only would this make it easier for us to tell who's who at a quick glance, it'll also give our opponents less to grab onto during the fight. Plus, we can even ball them up on our offhands to use as improvised shields from forking attacks. Anyway, once our main force makes contact with O's, the flanking team will swing around and start ripping them up from the side. Worst case scenario, the flankers get spotted while maneuvering and have to charge right in. But at that point, we wouldn't be any worse off than if we'd gone with a frontal assault. Now, don't get me wrong, we're definitely gonna lose people doing this, but as long as we're able to drop even a single O for each of them, we'll still have the majority, and that means it'll all be worth it. So yeah, that's my plan, but what is Gi-hun thinking?
No, we can't do that. We'd be playing right into their hands if we did.
By they, he means the organizers, and by playing into their hands, he means killing each other. Cause, you know, sitting back and allowing the O's to slaughter a bunch of you totally isn't playing into their hands at all. And yet, somehow that's exactly what Gi-hun thinks that they should do. Why, you ask? Well, it turns out he's still hell-bent on going after the people running this nightmare. But to do that, he'll need firearms. And where will he get them? From the guards, of course. You see, Gi-hun's plan is for him and a few others to hide under their beds and do absolutely nothing, while the O's are busy stabbing everyone to death. Then, right before the pink dudes roll in to break up the fight, our heroes will sneak out from their hiding places and play dead to try and bait them over. Once that happens, Gi-hun and company will spring into action, grab a hold of the guards' weapons, and kill them all before staging a frontal assault up a staircase on the game's control room. Now, before I go over all the reasons why this is a terrible idea, let me start by saying I 100% agree that big squid's a real enemy here. However, that doesn't change the fact that every person the O's kill is one less pair of hands to join you on your mission. I mean, just think about it. Why would the people who want to stay and play more games help you destroy them? Sure, I suppose you could always tell them they stand to gain even more money by raiding the organizers' vaults. But do you really expect them to believe that they have a better chance of surviving a protracted gunfight against an unknown number of enemies over a bunch of stupid death games? I sincerely doubt it. So no, if anyone should have to die in this situation, it should be the people who at best won't help you, and at worst will be actively working against you. After all, there's literally no reason why you and a few others couldn't still hide under your beds while the rest of the X's launched an attack. Furthermore, by allowing the O's to cross over to your side, you're only increasing the likelihood of them finding you under there and forking you up while you're basically helpless. I mean, for Christ's sake, couldn't you at least warn the others about the impending attack beforehand so none of them get stabbed to death in their sleep? Seriously, you would think that ensuring a far greater number of X's survive compared to O's would be one of Gi-hun's top priorities. At least then, when his little rebellion falls flat on its face, there still might be a chance for the others to vote their way out. And don't even try to say that they won't be allowed to leave. Back in Season 1, Gi-hun watched firsthand as over 200 players were gunned down playing red light, green light. And just a few hours later, he was back on the streets with no obligation to return. Dude might not want to admit it, but at the end of the day, voting to end the games is the only possible way any of these people are making it out of here alive. The rebellion will fail. Everyone who participates in it will be killed. And O's are going to vote to keep playing, and then all but one of them is going to die. But alas, it seems that once again, Gi-hun is willing to let his absurd ideals take precedence over practicality. And so, with everyone in place, our hero launches Operation Calamari. Huh, well, that went better than expected. Still, it's not gonna make a difference. After wiping out all the responding guards, the players only recovered a dozen or so MP5s, with a few mags each, and maybe a couple revolvers. And what are they going up against? Well, that's the thing. No one has any idea. Granted, they could lean on the prisoner they took after the initial attack, but without any way of verifying his information, he could easily mislead them or guide them into an ambush. Which is exactly what happens. No, just about the only way I could see this plan having even the slightest chance of success is if they stripped the jumpsuits off the dead pink dudes and tried going up incognito to catch them off guard. Our guys shot out most of the cameras in the dormitory after taking over, so it's possible the organizers wouldn't see it coming. That said, they'll almost certainly have additional surveillance set up on the stairwell, and if they spot a bunch of blood-splattered minions walking up from an area where they already knew that there were no survivors, it's probably game over. After all, there could be anything up there. The pink dudes could be setting up crew-served weapons. They could have body armor, grenades, claymore mines, poison gas, you name it. And even if it's just more grunts with submachine guns, there's absolutely no way of telling how many there might be. I mean, how could our guys possibly know whether they have enough ammunition to even make a dent in them? Oh, and speaking of ammunition, someone in the group decided it'd be a good idea to leave a whole bunch of loaded magazines back in the dormitory. Sure, it'd be one thing if they left a couple guns behind in case more pink dudes showed up in the elevator, but they didn't even think to do that. They just straight up abandoned them for no reason. So now once they start running low, they have to send Upham down to get more rounds. And just like his namesake, the dude totally freaks out at the thought of doing something useful and decides he'd rather leave them all to die. However, in his defense, the situation back upstairs is already hopeless. The brunt of the rebels are pinned down behind a low cover and severely outnumbered. And while Gi-hun and company make decent progress moving up ahead, it's only a matter of time before they too run out of ammunition. And with that, our hero is captured and forced to watch as one of his closest friends is executed right in front of him. Meanwhile, almost all the other rebels that hadn't already been killed in the firefight are summarily shot for their unsportsmanlike misconduct. Now, before we wrap up, there's one last thing that I want to address. Those of you who watch the show, or even just season 1, will know that player 1 was actually Hwang In-ho, aka the frontman himself. And although Gi-hun couldn't have possibly known that he was the man in charge, there were several clues throughout this round of games that strongly suggest that he was a mole. First was during the six-legged pentathlon. The boys were straight up cruising through the challenges until they reached the spinning top, at which point In-ho's bumbling near got them all Swiss cheesed. Ordinarily, this would mean nothing. It's a hard game and accidents happen. But when you take a closer look, you'll notice that every time he failed miserably, he was using his right hand. And then once he switched to his left, he nailed it on the first try. That's a little weird, don't you think? My guess is that he was just trying to run out the clock a bit using his non-dominant hand to crank up the drama. Gotta give those VIPs a show, right? Also, right before the pentathlon started, he addressed Gi-hun by his first name, which Gi-hun finds odd because he actually never shared it with him. Moreover, when asked about this, In-ho appears to be caught completely off guard. And his response, though believable on its own, was delivered in a rather deceptive fashion. And finally, the dude was player number 1. Back in the first season, Player 1 was revealed to be the game's creator and chief executive who willingly entered the games to have a little excitement before he ultimately passed away from cancer. Knowing this, it's pretty hard to believe that they would make the plant number 1 again, knowing Gi-hun was coming back, but maybe they thought he wouldn't expect it. At the very least, our guy should have suspected that there'd be a squid in sheep's clothing based on his previous experience. And while they could have easily been wearing any number, it should have stuck out to him that the only person behaving suspiciously was also wearing the same number as a known infiltrator. Oh yeah, there's also the fact that In-ho's alias for the games was Young-il, which is phonetically similar to Young-il, or 01 in Korean. That's almost like an alien naming himself Human to blend in with the population. Anyway, taken by themselves, none of these things would be a dead giveaway, but when you combine them all together, it seems fairly damn. And yes, I realize In-ho voted twice to end the games, but if anything, this was just to get on Gi-hun's good side. And besides, the creator himself cast the deciding vote to end the games back in Season 1, so that really doesn't mean anything. Of course, the fact that he shot his fair share of pink dudes would probably go a long way towards proving his innocence in Gi-hun's mind. But remember, the people running this show are insane. Just look at the recruiter. Point is, if somebody's willing to trick a bunch of innocent people into playing literal death games, they're probably willing to ice a few of their own peons as well. So, assuming Gi-hun pieced this all together in time to act, what could he have done about it? Well, unfortunately, the answer is not much. After all, if we got rid of him somehow, it would have cost us a vote in favor of leaving. And if at any point In-ho realized we were onto him, he would have almost certainly started making life difficult for us, probably by changing his vote. However, on the positive side, realizing that one of his strongest allies was actually a plant might very well have discouraged Gi-hun from launching the ill-fated rebellion. And while there was certainly no guarantee we would have beaten the O's, I still think that that route would have been the far better option. In the end, our hero remains imprisoned, and not a single step closer to ending the games. And with his hired mercenary stuck wandering the ocean in search of an island they'll likely never find, there's a pretty good chance Gi-hun won't be getting out of here alive. That said, had he and the others taken our advice from the beginning, I think that there's a solid possibility that they would have gotten a shot at the VIPs. However, once Gi-hun entered the games, he should have suspended his quest for revenge entirely and remained focused on surviving until players could vote to end the games. Doing so would have allowed him to save a few dozen players, and it would have also given him a chance to regroup with the mercs and start working on another plan. In addition to all that, we also came up with some pretty solid strategies for all the games presented, and for that reason, I think Squid Games Season 2 was beaten. Thanks for watching, and remember, never play roulette with strangers.